Okay, so we sort of have a problem because across the last couple of weeks, this has been the price movement of Ethereum. Yes, if you take a look at the chart that I'm sharing on screen, the price of Ethereum has stayed flat around the $3,000 range across the month of December. In fact, if you look at the returns right at the bottom of the screen, you can see that Ethereum is just down by around 0.5% across the last 30 days. Now, the problem comes when you take a look at this second chart, and this actually shows the price movement of BMNR during the same time frame, and BMNR stock is down over 10% during the time frame when Ethereum's price has stayed relatively flat. And that is exactly why investors are pissed off, and they have every right to be. And in this video, what we will be doing is to be looking at some of the news surrounding BMNR recently and address the claims of Ethereum potentially reaching the $1,800 to $2,000 range and explore the valuation of BMNR if such a scenario actually plays out and whether or not Tom Lee's thesis is actually broken. But as always, potential is a dangerous word, so let's dive in. If you have been following the channel across the last couple of weeks, you would have seen that I have posted around 7 or 8 videos talking about the thesis between Ethereum and BMNR and how the two of them go together and how to actually think about BMNR's valuation. And so if you're not yet caught up to speed, I'll be leaving the links to those videos down below for you. And I just want to address something that I've seen in the comments because people have actually asked me why is it that in some of these videos, some of the information that are being used or being discussed seem a little bit late, and the main reason for that is that because for the most part of the last 3 months of 2025, I was actually out of Singapore. I wasn't in my room, so I had to prepare a lot of these videos beforehand, and I only could make minor changes along the way. So right now, it's 2026, I'm back at home, back in Singapore, back in the grind, and therefore there will be a weekly BMNR update for as long as it is relevant, and we will be tracking their valuation and overall trajectory of the company as they progress towards their goal of getting to the 5% target of Ethereum. But let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, and that is the upcoming shareholder vote on 14th of January. This is not to be confused with the shareholder meeting on 15th of January. Now, what this is that the board have actually asked shareholders for approval of a potential 50 billion share dilution. Now, I am well aware that what they're asking for is approval of potential dilution. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily use all 50 billion shares. I am very clear on that. But I have to say that I feel a little bit uneasy with the numbers that are being proposed. You see, you have to admit that right now, sentiment around the company is pretty low. Now, I'm not super affected by the sentiment around the company. I really couldn't care less. I trust Tom Lee. I look at the metrics regarding Ethereum and BMNR, and everything seems to be progressing in the right direction. I do trust Tom Lee's analysis, and I trust the management team that he has put in place. However, I do have to admit that I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the 50 billion share dilution. It's a little bit too much leash to be giving the company, I feel. And the reason why I feel that way is that because if you consider some of the biggest companies in the world, companies like Apple, $4 trillion market cap with around a 14 billion share outstanding. And if you consider the biggest company in the world, Nvidia, they also only have around a 24 billion shares outstanding. So if you think that the biggest companies in the world are only somewhere between 14 to 24 billion shares, so 50 billion really seems like, a little bit too much leeway to be giving the management. So it's not something that is a thesis breaker for me, but it's something definitely that I would be concerned about if it goes through, and something that I'll be paying even more close attention to. And I think as investors, sometimes we can become a little bit too dogmatic with our investments. We have to back our company to the hill. We have to back the management all the time. The management can do no wrong. And I think by doing that, sometimes myself included, we catch ourselves with our head up our ass, and we actually get blindsided when something actually goes wrong. I think it's important to be honest with ourselves that, we can actually trust the management and at the same time have some doubts or some concerns over their actions. And both of these things can be true at the same time. So that should something happen, should something bad actually happens, you as an investor would know the reason why, and you would know how to react accordingly to protect your portfolio. And so that is why I actually feel comfortable with saying that despite me trusting management, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with this particular move. But like I've said in many of my previous videos, the long-term thesis around BMNR has nothing to do with all of these financial engineering. Now, all this financial engineering that they're doing, definitely, In the short term, they can definitely generate some shareholder value, but in the long term, all of this only works if there is a large-scale adoption of Ethereum, and that is exactly what we are seeing. And so in December, even though the price of BMNR has been falling, we are continuing to see institutions come on-chain, and we're starting to see a greater adoption of Ethereum, right? JP Morgan has actually launched their very own tokenized money market fund, and they are definitely in good company, joining other financial institutions like BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, as well as Fidelity. And then we're also starting to see regulations being put in place. We already know that the CFTC has started to allow Bitcoin, Ethereum, as well as USDC to be used as collateral in the derivatives market. And on the ETF front, projections are asset under management in the crypto space is projected to double from $200 billion to $400 billion by the end of 2026. That is additional buying pressure that will come into the demand side of the equation. But I think beyond the financial institutions, we're also starting to see the effects of the Fusaka upgrade, with fees being lowered and transactions going up. Now, on a broader scale, you see on the whole of the fourth quarter, which includes pre-Fusaka and post-Fusaka, Ethereum posted 8.7 million new smart contracts being deployed on their network, which is an all-time high. So this proves the adoption story, and this actually kind of shows the effects of Fusaka. So let me break it down for you. If you take a look at some of these news reports, the layer 1 of Ethereum has actually posted around 2 million transactions in a single day, which is a record for them, and fees have fallen to just 17 cents. Now, for context, on 10th of October, during the crypto liquidation event, fees that time were around $8.50. So you can see the decrease in fees have driven up adoption of Ethereum. And today, as on the 2nd of January 2026, we're also seeing similar news reports to support this, where people are saying that the daily transaction on Ethereum has reached an all-time high, surpassing the 2021 high during the NFT craze. And so what you're seeing on this chart over here is that the transaction per second has been relatively stable since 2023. However, we are starting to see a step change up in the first half of 2025, and round about here where the Fusaka upgrade happened, there is another step change up in terms of the number of transactions per second. However, where you're seeing the real impact is in this second chart over here, because the transactions on layer 1 are still minimal compared to what is happening on the L2s, and you can see that the transaction per second on the L2s are actually 77 times more than the L1s, even after a slight decrease due to the holiday season. And all of this actually points towards the wider adoption of Ethereum. And so putting all of this together, we know that things are progressing in the right direction, and ultimately it is the adoption of Ethereum that will drive real value for BMNR and its shareholders. And if you have been following other creators like Tanner and Tavis, then this chart might not be new to you. They have shared this before. This chart basically shows you the number of Ethereum left on the exchanges, and this number has been falling. You can see that this is depicted by the purple line in the chart over here, and if you pay attention right to the last couple of weeks, right at the bottom of the screen, you can see that this number has somewhat ticked back up slightly in recent weeks, but it is still near all-time lows. And I think a lot of people has already covered the effects of supply and demand and what this chart actually means for supply and demand. But I think I want to go a little bit further than that and give a slightly different take, or a slightly more nuanced take about this, something that hasn't really been mentioned a lot. You see, if you remember the Bankless podcast that Tom Lee was on, one of the questions they actually asked him is that how is he buying so much Ethereum while the price of Ethereum was still being stuck at that point in time around $3,500? And Tom Lee actually kind of sidestepped that question, and he said that, they have proprietary methods of buying Ethereum while keeping the price more or less stable, and I would assume that assumes certain over-the-counter kind of purchases that doesn't immediately move the price of Ethereum in the market. And so when I listen to this, all it tells me is that if Tom Lee can do that, I think my assumption is that he's not the only person in the entire world that knows how to do that. The other institutions that are buying are likely employing the same strategy. And so because of that, it really doesn't benefit anyone for them to actually see the price of Ethereum go up while they are in the accumulation phase. And so because of that, I think it's important to pay attention to how much the supply of ETH is dropping, but I don't think we have to be too worried that the timeline of why the supply is dropping, and then we're still not seeing the price going up, because we know, and Tom Lee has told us, that him as well as some of these institutions that are acquiring Ethereum have proprietary methods to acquire ETH without drastically moving the price of ETH in the market, because it stands to benefit all of them to be able to accumulate ETH at a decent price. But if only things were that simple, because you see, one of the most controversial stories surrounding Ethereum and BMNR recently has to do with an internal, let's call it, difference of direction within Fundstrat. Now, Sean Farrell, which is the head of crypto strategy, in his base case actually sees Ethereum going down to somewhere around $1,800 to $2,000, whereas Tom Lee has been public in saying that he expects Ethereum to recover to between $6,000 to $7,000 by January of 2026. You see, when I was releasing that series of videos, I've never had the opportunity to jump in and clarify certain things, because I know there has been a lot of debate surrounding the topic of whether or not crypto still trades in a 4-year cycle, and I will be the first to tell you that I don't know for sure whether or not the cycle is broken. My initial assumption is that the cycle is not broken and that we are entering a crypto winter, and that is the basis of my understanding when I make my purchase of BMNR. So even if we do enter a crypto cycle, I'm not worried. I have capital on hand to actually deploy and buy during the winter. So you see, I understand the whole logic that Tom Lee has shared previously about lining up the crypto cycle with the ISM data. I have also seen people comparing the crypto cycle with PMI data. But if you look at the technicals, I think we are in a bearish downtrend, and we have been struggling at around the 50-day moving average. And so I think what is important in the short to medium term is that we see Ethereum reclaim that 50-day moving average before we even think of moving higher. And if we are unable to do so because we have rejected off that level a couple of times, then I think we see Ethereum go lower before it rebounds. I'm not actually expecting $1,800 to $2,000, but I'm expecting it to drop perhaps closer to $2,200 to $2,400. As such, I've actually closed off some of my cash secured puts at higher strikes. Some of them were actually closed at a loss, but I don't mind that, because this actually means that I have cash on hand should we see any dip, and otherwise I'll use the collateral to sell slightly more conservative cash secured puts to make up the premium that we have lost. But like I said, not to worry, because later on, as we cover the valuation, I will show you what will happen to the valuation of BMNR if Ethereum really dips to the $1,800 to $2,000 range. But in better news, it is exciting to see that BMNR has finally started staking. They're actually reporting the number of Ethereum that are being staked every single week. Right now, the latest numbers come in at 408,627 ETH, and I think we're going to get a lot more clarity around their staking solutions on 15th of January 2026 during the shareholders meeting. We know that they're setting up Maven, their own validator network, with 3 other partners, and I think we want to have a little bit more information of the kind of yields that they're looking at. If I'm not wrong, they're looking at somewhere between 2.9 to 3% yields, and how they plan to scale up the entire operation and what they plan to do thereafter. So I think it's also interesting right now to take a look at the validator queue, and for the first time in a long while, the inflows into the Ethereum network are exceeding the outflows, and that means validators are coming online to secure the network, and this really plays into the entire BMNR flywheel. You see, the validators coming into the Ethereum network makes the network even more secure. This encourages the wider adoption of Ethereum, which drives up the price of Ethereum, and as a result, also driving up the price of BMNR as well. And so with that, let's jump into the valuation. And the first thing I want to show you is this chart over here. Now, this chart actually shows you the number of ETH on BMNR's balance sheet, as well as the pace of ETH accumulation. The blue bars that you're seeing, this shows you the total number of ETH on the balance sheet of BMNR, and the red line shows you how many ETH that are being bought every single week. So if you look at the blue bar, the latest on the 29th of December, this stands at over 4 million ETH on their balance sheet. Let me just take a look at the numbers. So on 29th of December, BMNR currently holds around 4.1 million ETH on their balance sheet, and this works out to be around 3.4% of the outstanding supply of ETH. But I think what is concerning investors is the red line over here. This red line has been slowly decreasing across the last couple of weeks. And in the most recent week, on 29th of December, this reached an all-time low where they only purchased 44,463 Ethereum. the lowest since they have started this strategy back in June and July of this year. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, Tom Lee actually said that based on Tom DeMark's advice, they actually initially slowed down their ETH purchase to around the 50,000 range, which is what you're seeing over here on the 17th of November. Now, since then, Tom DeMark has actually given them some sort of a green light to continue to re-accelerate their pace of ETH purchasing. And if you extrapolate that relationship, that Tom DeMark was the one that told them to initially slow down their ETH purchase and then later on give them the green light to re-accelerate their pace of purchase, then it is fair to assume, at least to me, that their most recent slowdown to 44,000 is likely due to the advice of Tom DeMark. And we already know that Tom DeMark is someone that is very in tune with the technicals, and he is likely seeing some market structure or something that is spooking him, and that is why he is advising BMNR to slow down their ETH purchase and perhaps keep some dry powder at the side, which explains the cash that they have on hand. And so for me, I think this actually means, if you put everything together, it is likely that Sean Farrell's case actually might come true, and we might see Ethereum fall even lower to where it is today, perhaps to the $1,800 to $2,000 range before it rebounds later on in the year. Now, I know at the time on recording, BMNR is actually up over 8% today, and ETH is up over 3,000 as well. So if it can actually reclaim 3,000, which is the 50-day moving average, then perhaps we have nothing to worry about. But for me, because I am not someone who claimed to be fantastic at technical analysis, that is why what I'm doing is that across the next couple of weeks, I'll be averaging around a $500 purchase of Ethereum, not BMNR. I'm buying ETH, $500 until the point that Ethereum reaches around $5,000. I think that's when I'll stop my ETH purchases. And on the BMNR front, currently my average stands at in the $44 to $45 range. And I'm not currently looking to add. I have sold some cash secured puts down at $20, and I don't know whether or not it will get that low, but I use it as a little bit of a psychological trick, and you will see why later on as I go through the valuation. But the whole point over here is that if BMNR gets to $20, then I will be buying it at a price which would drastically lower my cost basis down to the $30 ranges, which would make it easier for me to turn around and sell some covered calls as we wait to recoup our capital, as we wait for the price to recover. However, if it doesn't hit the $20 range and my strike price doesn't hit, I don't get assigned the shares, this means that BMNR never hits $20. And if it rebounds from here, I have more than enough shares for me not to FOMO should it shoot back up to the $50 to $60 range. So this is a psychological trick I use with cash secured puts to keep me grounded in such volatility. So if it doesn't get to $20, that's fine. I have enough. It goes back up. I will be happy with my returns. If it gets to $20, I lower my cost basis so significantly that I can turn around and easily sell covered calls on the position. And so this second chart that you're seeing over here, also a blue bar with red lines, this actually shows you their cash position has remained steady at around $1 billion over the last 4 weeks. You can see this is depicted by the 4 blue bars that you're seeing right at the end over here, which means that, their capital raise has also slowed down along with their ETH purchases. And I think while many people actually see this as a negative, I have a more neutral to positive stance towards what is happening. I actually think Tom Lee and BMNR is being responsible towards shareholders, because I rather management take a more conservative approach and moderating their capital raises while they are trading at or slightly below MNAV. And I feel a lot more comfortable with the current capital structure without any debt on their balance sheet compared to something like MicroStrategy, where they issue debt in order to buy more Bitcoin, but it makes their balance sheet a lot more confusing. And with such a clean balance sheet, this actually means that Ethereum could even fall all the way down to $1,200 to even $1,000, and BMNR will not feel any pressure to liquidate their holdings. And as an investor who invests in BMNR with the thesis that they're going to be able to hold their Ethereum for the long term, this is something that is very comforting for me, and this is something that makes me even more confident in the investment for the long term. Now, if you do a very quick math with me, with the $1 billion worth of cash that they have on hand, even if Ethereum falls to the $1,800 to $2,000 range, which is Sean Farrell's base case, and BMNR also feels like that is a bottom, they can actually immediately deploy that $1 billion worth of cash, and they could purchase anywhere between 500,000 to 555,000 ETH immediately. right? And on top of that, I think what people actually forget is that on one of the podcasts that Tom Lee was on recently, he also suggested the possibility of the consolidations of all of these digital asset treasuries, and he could actually use the capital on hand to go out and purchase another digital treasury trading significantly below its NAV, and so and therefore consolidating all of the digital treasuries into a few of the bigger players. And so with that, I think whatever strategy that they choose to do, this will immediately bring them significantly closer to their target of owning 5% of the entire outstanding supply of Ethereum. So I think you really do need to understand how the valuation of BMNR will work when Ethereum reaches $1,800 to $2,000 in order to understand why I keep saying that I am not worried. By now, most of you should be familiar with this page that you are seeing. I've made some changes so that the math works out even more clearly, and I've also updated the numbers as best as I can. Now, this page is basically written in multiples of millions unless it is on a per share basis. So right now, depending on the source that you use, you get to a number of shares outstanding somewhere around 425 million. This is an increase the 380 million shares outstanding that they declared during their earnings. And this actually makes sense based on the pace of dilution and capital raises that they have done. Because if you take a look at the price of BMNR today, at the time of recording, pre-market, they were at around $27, right? Right now, they're around $29.30. But if you take the $29 and multiply it by this 425 million shares outstanding, you end up with a market cap of $11.5 billion, which is right about where they are when you take a look at all the exchanges. Based on their latest disclosure on the 29th of December, BMNR has around 4.1 million Ethereum on their balance sheet with around $1 billion of cash on hand. This is what you're seeing in this first two chart over here. $4.1 billion worth of ETH, with the price of ETH today around $3,080. This gives you the value of ETH on their balance sheet at around $12.6 billion. This is the $1 billion of cash that they have on hand without any debt. And then smaller values over here that you're seeing, it's basically their Bitcoin holdings as well as their investments in 8Co. So if you put all these four numbers together, you get a total net asset value coming in at around $13.7 billion. But if you take out the value of their Bitcoin holdings as well as their moonshot investments, purely looking at the Ethereum as well as the cash holdings, it makes their total net asset value come in at around $13.6 million. And if you look at it at a per share basis, the net asset value per share would come in at around $32.12. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you, at $32.12, they are still trading slightly below MNAV. I'm going to highlight it in blue over here at around 0.91. Right, so that is why they have not been so aggressive with their capital raises. And I'm going to say it, I really think that that is being responsible to shareholders. They're only raising capital at an aggressive pace when they are trading above MNAV. So I really have no problems with that. Now, I have adjusted some of my expectations and assumptions based on recent information that has come out. Now, if you actually pay attention to the recent podcast with Farouk, Tom Lee on that podcast actually told us that BitMine officially started their strategy of purchasing ETH on the 30th of June 2025. So I've changed my start date down from 9th of June to 30th of June. This is just a small change of 21 days. It doesn't really make a big difference. So far, they have done this strategy for around 187 days. And on average, they have purchased around 21,981 Ethereum every single day. Now, if I were to project this from now all the way to the 31st of March 2026, at the end of Q1 2026, basically, this is the numbers that we are going to be using. Now, for the margin of safety, previously I've been using 20% whenever we do our valuation, but right now I'm choosing to increase this margin of safety to 30%. This margin of safety basically lowers the rate of accumulation of ETH. And I think the reason for this, as we have mentioned earlier, is that it seems like BMNR is taking a more conservative approach in the next couple of weeks as we wait and see what is going to happen to the price of Ethereum on the advice of Tom DeMark. And so this 30% margin of safety, slowing down their rate of accumulation even more than what we have done previously, is to account for the actual reality of BMNR slowing down their ETH purchase. Now, from today, 2nd of January to 31st of March, there are a total of 87 days to the target date, which means that by then they would have added another 1.4 million ETH on their balance sheet if they continue adding at around 15,000 ETH per day. This would put their entire ETH balance at around 5.4 million ETH on their balance sheet. Moving on from that, if we project the price of Ethereum to be around $2,000 sometime in the first quarter of 2026, between now and 31st of March, basically, and that means Sean Farrell was right, Ethereum reaches $1,800 to around $2,000. Let's see what happens. The value of Ethereum on BMNR's balance sheet would fall to around just under $11 billion. And I'm also going to be assuming if this does happen, that their capital raises until that point in time continues to be slow, which means that they maintain more or less their $1 billion of cash on hand pretty comfortably. And with that, the projected net asset value would come in at $11.9 billion. Now, then, depending on your rate of dilution for our bear, base, and bull case, you'll end up with different net asset value per share as well as different share prices. Now, if you take a look with me, in the most bearish scenario, we are assuming 45% dilution from the 425 shares, which means that in the next 3 months, they will dilute by 45%. At an MNAV of 0.9, which means it doesn't change from today. The net asset value per share in this scenario would come in at around $19.27, and at a 0.9 times MNAV, BMNR's bearish price target would be around $17.48. Now, in the base case, we are assuming a 40% dilution with an MNAV of around 1.2, which is where they were trading at just a couple of weeks ago. This would make the price target come in at around $23.95. And in the most bullish scenario, with only 35% dilution and an MNAV of 1.5, you realize that this is actually fallen down all the way from 2 to 1.8 to now I'm just using 1.5 in the most bullish scenario. Then you end up with a price target of around $31.05. And if you put all this together, you end up with a BMNR price target over here of around $24.11, which means there is roughly around a 20% downside from where we are today, right? Actually, in my original script, it says 10% because I was writing this pre-market where it was only around $26, $27. So it was a 10% downside from there. But after the rise that we are seeing today, it means that there's around a 19% downside from here. So if you take a 20% margin of safety from this $24 price, you end up with a margin of safety or a price target of around $19.44, if I'm not mistaken, 0.8. My goodness, typing. Right, you get a price target of around $19.29, and that is where to start adding BMNR again. If it doesn't hit these prices, and it doesn't need to hit these prices, I will be happy with my current holdings and I will continue to ride it all the way back up. But if it does fall, this is the price where I will start to add BMNR again, and that is why I have sold my cash secured puts in the $20 range. And so putting all of this together, I think we know directionally Ethereum is progressing in the right direction. I think there is definitely going to be some price volatility around BMNR and Ethereum, and I think for the average investor like you and me, it is more prudent to just dollar cost average over the next couple of weeks if your position is not at the size that you really want it to be, rather than all in at a certain point in time. And I think beyond that, it is also important to remember that there are things that BMNR can actually do if Ethereum does fall to the $1,800 to $2,000 range in order to protect shareholder value. But I'll talk more about that in the next video, and I'll see you in the next one.